He did not sleep. That should be noted, not as a small thing, not as a man who simply lay awake with his thoughts the way men sometimes do when the day has been difficult or the wine too thin or the accounts too troubling. He did not sleep the way a person does not sleep after the world has been quietly, irrevocably reordered while they were standing in a courtyard in their nightclothes. He lay on his back in the dark with his hands flat at his sides and his eyes open and the heat of her still present somewhere in his sternum, like a coal pressed there and forgotten. And he thought about 11 copper coins and the particular arrogance of a man who buys something without looking at it, and he understood, in the specific merciless clarity that only arrives in the hours before dawn, that he had never been the one making choices. Not from the moment he saw her in the market. Not from the moment his hand moved toward the coin purse. The choice had been made before he arrived. He had only been the mechanism by which it was delivered. She had known. That was the thing that kept returning, unwanted and precise, pressing itself against the inside of his ribs. She had known from the very beginning. The stillness in the market, that hadn't been defeat. That had been patience. The silence in the cart, the eyes on the middle distance, the spine unbowed in a place that broke everything it touched. She hadn't been surviving her circumstances. She had been allowing them. There is a difference, and the difference is the entire distance between a slave and a goddess, and he had not seen it, and she had known he would not, and she had come home with him anyway. He rolled onto his side. Through the wall, through 2 corridors and a servant's stare and the east wing's particular silence, he was aware of her the way you are aware of a fire in an adjacent room, not visible, not audible, but present in the temperature of the air, in the way the darkness felt warmer on one side than the other. He did not understand yet what the blood bond meant. That understanding was coming. It was moving toward him through the dark with the patience of something that has all the time in the world because it has already happened, and all that remains is for him to catch up to it. By morning, Marit had noticed 3 things she could not explain and would not say aloud. The east corridor's temperature, which had risen overnight by a degree that had no source. The hearthstone ash had scrubbed 6 days running, which now bore, at its center, a faint pattern that had not been there before and would not scrub out, and the girl herself, who moved through the morning kitchen with the same silence as always, the same downcast efficiency, the same refusal to take up more space. Then a shadow, but who, Marit felt in her bones and would not put words to, was not the same creature who had arrived in the cart. Something had shifted. Something that lived below the surface of behavior and above the surface of the explainable had moved 1 inch in a direction Marit had no name for, and she was a woman of 60 years and considerable sense, and she knew, the way animals know weather, that the house was different now. She said nothing. She gave Ash the heaviest work she had, which was the way Marit handled things she did not understand by pretending, through action, that the hierarchy still held. Ash took the work without expression. She carried the buckets and beat the rugs and hauled the wood and did every single thing she was asked, and Marit watched her do it, and somewhere underneath the comfort of the familiar, underneath the reassurance of a girl on her knees with a brush, the cold thing kept pressing, this is not what it looks like. This has not been what it looks like from the very beginning. Karan came downstairs mid-morning looking like a man who had survived a battle he had not prepared for, which was accurate. He walked into the kitchen for no reason he was willing to examine and found it empty except for Ash, who was at the far basin with her back to the door and her arms in water to the elbow and steam rising around her in the cold morning light, and the sight of her, the curve of her neck where she'd pushed her hair aside, the line of her shoulder, the specific quality of her stillness, which he now understood was not emptiness, but containment, not absence, but everything held deliberately interior, stopped him in the doorframe the same way it had stopped him in the east corridor, the same way he was beginning to understand it would always stop him, because some things do not lose their power with familiarity, they accumulate it. They become more themselves the more you know them. She did not turn around. She knew he was there. He knew she knew. They had been in this particular silence before, but it meant something different now. It had weight it hadn't had a week ago. It had history. It had a courtyard and a moonlit fire, and the specific terrible intimacy of having been truly seen by someone and not having run. "You have questions," she said, still not turning. "I have nothing but," he said. She lifted her arms from the water and dried them on the rough cloth at her hip and turned, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and did something to her that he was not going to let himself think about. And she looked at him with the directness she'd always had, except that now it carried something else in it. Not softness exactly, but an aperture, some previously closed thing opened by a degree, letting in a sliver of something warmer than assessment. "Ask one," she said. "One. Out of the 100 pressing against the inside of a skull, out of the blood bond and the ritual markings and the fire that hadn't burned her and the gods that were apparently not as dead as every surviving text had agreed, one." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then, are you afraid?" She had not been expecting that one. He saw it, the brief, involuntary shift in her expression, there and gone like heat lightning, the microfracture in the absolute composure that told him he had aimed somewhere true. She was quiet for long enough that the kitchen sounds, the settle of the fire, the distant work of the yard came and went between them. "Not of the power," she said finally. He understood, without asking, what that left. If you feel the weight of everything not being said in that kitchen, if you are already counting the distance between what they mean and what they can allow themselves to say, you are in this story now, fully and without escape, and you should be. Drop a comment and tell me which of them you think is more afraid. Because the answer is not what either of them would tell you. He left the kitchen because staying would have required him to be someone he did not yet know how to be in her presence, someone undefended, someone who had set down the role of owner and had not yet picked up whatever came next. He walked the manor instead, which was something he'd been doing more of since she arrived, as if the house required inspection it hadn't needed before, as if movement were a substitute for the stillness she occupied so completely. He walked and he thought about the blood bond and what little he knew of the old religion fragments, mostly the kind of knowledge that survives in households like his as superstition and half-story, the god's fire, the priestess line, the extinction that had come when the last of the altars burned and the last of the faithful were put to the sword by a king 3 generations dead who had feared what he could not tax. It had been a tidying, that extinction. That was how history remembered it. A tidying. He stopped in the east corridor and looked at the hearthstone. The mark was there. Circular, branching, older than the manor by centuries, the same family of pattern as the markings on her back, which he had only seen for one illuminated minute in a courtyard at midnight, and which had nonetheless arranged themselves permanently in his memory with the precision of things burned rather than learned. He crouched and touched the edge of it, and his fingertip came away warm. Not the warmth of residual fire. The warmth of something living. The blood bond, the fragment said, or what fragments said anything at all, was not a leash. The old-world scholars who had written about it, before the writing was made illegal, before the libraries were tidied the same way the altars were, had been very specific on this point. It was not a leash. The power did not pass to the buyer. The power recognized the buyer, and the recognition changed both of them, and the change was permanent and mutual and could not be transferred or sold or dissolved, which was, he now understood, why the king had not simply purchased the last high priestess and put her to work. You could not put that particular fire to work. You could only stand next to it and decide whether to be burned or illuminated and pray, in your last moment of choice, that you had the character to deserve the second option. He was not certain he did. He was beginning to understand that uncertainty was the price of honesty, and honesty was apparently what she required. She had spent years, perhaps all her life, in the company of people who looked at her and saw only what they needed to see: a laborer, a body, a purchase. He was the first person to look away and catch himself doing it, and the catching had mattered, and the staying in the courtyard had mattered. And now he was crouched in a corridor with a worm mark under his fingertips and a kingdom worth of reckoning already in motion. And the only question that had real weight was not how to contain what was coming, but whether he was capable of the one thing she had not yet decided he was, worth trusting. 3 days later, the inquisitors arrived. He heard the horses before he saw them, the specific rhythm of a king's house escort, 6 riders in the gray and black livery that meant the crown had taken an interest. His steward met them in the yard. Karen watched from the second-floor window and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature descend along his spine, because inquisitors did not ride to Outer Rim manors for reasons of courtesy. They rode for inventory, for assessment, for the particular brand of royal housekeeping that had, 3 generations ago, tidied the altars. Someone had seen something. Or someone had spoken. Or, and this was the thought he could not fully form without the cold becoming a fist, the markings had been visible from outside the courtyard walls on the night of the full moon, and the world beyond the manor was not as unobservant as he had been in the market. And the old religion, thought extinct, was suddenly worth looking for again. He left the window and moved through the manor faster than was dignified and found her in the servant quarters, and she was already standing, already watching the door he came through, and her expression told him she had known before the horses arrived, had felt them. Probably, the way she felt everything, through the temperature of the air, through the particular quality of the silence that precedes something heavy. "You need to hide," he said. She looked at him. Not the calculating look. Not the patient, measuring look. Something different, something that required more courage to read than he had been expecting. Because what was in it was the specific fragile thing that lives in a person who has been invisible their entire life being seen, and finding themselves unable to fully believe it. "You would hide me," she said. It was not a question. It was the rehearsal of a fact that had not yet been verified, spoken aloud to test whether the world would hold it. "Yes," he said. No hesitation. No calculation. The word was already out before whatever small, sensible part of him might have thought to weigh consequences had any opportunity to interfere, and the certainty of it surprised him, and she saw the surprise, and something in her face, that aperture again. That fractional opening widened by 1 more degree. There was a breath between them. Just a breath, just the span of an inhale in a small room with the sound of horses in the yard below and a kingdom's worth of danger narrowing to this corridor, this doorway. This unbearable foot of air between a man who had bought her for 11 coins and was now prepared to commit treason to keep her, and a goddess in a servant's shift who had never in her life had anyone stand between her and destruction, and was only just now feeling the full devastating weight of what that meant. He reached out, not reaching, exactly, more the involuntary motion of a hand that had decided before its owner did, and his fingers brushed the back of her wrist. Just once, just the lightest graze of contact. And the heat of her skin was the same heat as the markings, the same heat as the courtyard fire, the same heat that had been in every room she moved through and every silence she placed between them, and he understood it now for what it was. Recognition. The blood bond was not a transaction. It was a recognition. 2 things identifying each other across the unbridgeable distance of what they had each been before this. She did not pull her hand away. That was everything. That was the world beginning again on its axis. If this is the moment you have been waiting for, if you felt that touch the way it was meant to be felt, in the chest before the mind, then like this, share it. Subscribe so you are standing right here when the inquisitors knock on that door and everything inside this manor is forced into the open. Because what happens next will not be quiet. The fire does not stay hidden when someone comes looking for it. And the man who chose to stand between a goddess and a king will discover, in the next part of the story, exactly what his choice is worth and exactly what it will cost him and exactly, in the specific, irrevocable way that only the most dangerous love stories cost anything at all, how completely and permanently he is willing to pay it. She moved first. Not away, sideways, into the corridor's shadow, pressing her back against the cold stone, and the movement brought her close enough that when he stepped to follow her lead, to place himself at the door, visible, unremarkable, lord of a house receiving visitors. They were side by side in the narrow dark, and the heat between them was its own presence, its own weather, something that the cold stone had no answer for. She tilted her head and looked up at him from under her lashes with an expression that had no precedent in their 14 days of careful distance, something that was not quite trust, but was the exact landscape just outside its borders. And he looked down at her, and they were close enough that the keeping of all their careful distance suddenly seemed like the funniest, most implausible performance in the history of two people who had been lying to themselves from the very first glance in a dusty market. He stepped away. Because the inquisitors were in the yard. Because the kingdom did not yet know what it had inside these walls. Because there was a version of survival available to them that required him to be, for the next hour, exactly what he appeared to be, an unremarkable man of an unremarkable house, with nothing to declare, nothing to hide, nothing burning. He straightened his coat. He walked to the front of the manor. He felt her eyes on his back as he went, and the feeling was identical to the feeling of a fire at your back in winter, the kind you are grateful for, the kind you do not want to turn away from, the kind that follows you into every cold room for the rest of your life. The inquisitor's name was Solon Draith, and he had the face of a man who had made a long career of finding things that other people had been certain he would not find. He sat in Siren's receiving room with a cup of untouched wine and an expression of professional pleasantness that was its own particular species of threat, and he asked, in the tone of a man merely making conversation, whether the household had experienced any unusual occurrences in recent weeks. Karin said no. His voice was level. His hands were still. He thought about a girl in a corridor with her back against the stone and the warmth of her wrist under his fingers and the full moon's fire moving in orbital patterns above her spine, and he said no, nothing unusual, the manor is quiet, would you like more wine? Solon Draith looked at him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who had heard no and was calculating its specific texture. Then he smiled, not warmly, and set down the untouched cup and rose, and said he would not trouble the household further. The crown appreciated its cooperation, and he left. Karin stood in the receiving room until the horses were gone, and then stood there 3 minutes longer. And then he walked to the east corridor and leaned his back against the wall next to the hearthstone with the ancient mark and pressed his palms flat against the stone and breathed. She was there in 2 minutes. No sound on the stairs, no announcement. She was simply present, the way she was always simply present, materializing in his peripheral vision like a thing that exists in every room you turn toward. She stood across from him with her arms at her sides and her head tilted and that new expression on her face, the one with the aperture, the one with the fractional opening. And she said nothing for long enough that the silence between them finished several sentences neither of them had started. He'll come back, Karin said. Yes. With more. Yes. He looked at her across the corridor. The hearthstone's warmth pressed at his back. The faint glow of her marking was not visible in daylight, but he could feel it, felt it the way you feel a sound below the register of hearing, in the sternum, in the back of the teeth. The blood bond again. Tightening not like a chain but like a current, like two things aligned to the same source, recognizing each other at the frequency below language. I need to understand what I am to you, he said. Not what the bond is. What I am. Whether I am, he stopped. Tried again. Whether this is obligation or choice. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he had begun to accept no answer as the answer, which he would have borne, which would have been its own kind of wound he would have learned to carry. Then she crossed the corridor. Not all the way, she stopped 2 feet from him, inside the boundary of the heat between them but outside the boundary where any of it could be blamed on accident. Close enough. Deliberately close enough. Her chin lifted and her eyes met his, and in them was the thing she had been protecting behind the silence and the patience and the centuries of contained fire, something human and tender and terrifyingly unguarded. Something that had survived everything and was only now deciding it might be worth surviving toward. You stayed, she said. In the courtyard. You had every reason to run. So did you, he said. In the market. You had every reason to run. She looked at him, really looked, the way she always looked, except that now the looking was not inventory or assessment or the measuring of threat. It was the look of someone who has found a thing they had stopped believing existed and is holding very still so as not to startle it. I was waiting, she said quietly, for someone worth burning for. The corridor was very warm. The hearthstone behind him pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat. Outside, the day moved on in its unremarkable way, horses and market sounds, and the distant clatter of a kingdom that did not yet know it was standing on the edge of the age that would come after it. Inside, in the east corridor of a crumbling house, two people stood 2 feet apart in the charged air of everything that had been restrained for 14 days and a millennia before that, and the space between them was the most consequential geography in the known world. He did not reach for her. She did not step forward. The moment held itself open, trembling, the way a door holds itself open in a wind, not quite committed to closing, not quite committed to the full expanse of what lies beyond it, suspended in the last breath of before. That suspension would not last. The kingdom was already moving. Solon Draith was already on the road back to the capital with a report that would reach the crown before the week was out. And the crown had long arms and longer memory and the specific institutional hunger of a power that had once extinguished the god's fire and been watching, ever since, for the first sign of reignition. The world outside was gathering itself. The reckoning had a direction now. And the fire inside her, patient, ancient, already reshaping the temperature of every room it touched, was not going to stay interior much longer, not with the blood bond deepening, not with the markings waking further into each full moon, not with the geography of the realm already registering, in the language of weather and tremor and the particular direction of wind, that something had shifted in the balance of things. She was not a girl who scrubbed floors. She had never been. She was the continuation of a lineage that predated his kingdom, predated his king, predated the language his king used to name the gods whose fire he had tried to own and failed to extinguish. And she was standing in his corridor in a servant's shift with her eyes full of everything she had carried alone across the years, and he was the only person she had told, and the telling was its own covenant, its own irreversible act, as binding as any ritual and more honest than any prayer. The manor breathed around them. The candle at the end of the corridor burned with a flame that did not flicker. The mark on the hearthstone pulsed its low, patient warmth. And Karen Voss, who had made every consequential choice of the last 14 days without quite meaning to, made another one now, not by reaching for her, not by speaking, but by not doing what the sensible world would have required him to do in the presence of a power that could end kingdoms. He did not step back. He held the 2 feet of charged air between them like a man holding something precious and not yet certain he has earned it, and he let the warmth of her, the fire, the bond, the specific devastating humanity she had spent a lifetime hiding behind silence, settle into him the way heat settles into cold stone. He was changed. Had been changing since the market, since the cart, since the first corridor and the first stillness and the first moment her eyes had met his, and he had looked away and lied about it. He was not the same man who had reached for 11 copper coins in a dusty market, and he would never be that man again. And standing here in the warm corridor with the world gathering speed outside these walls, and the last high priestess of a dead religion 2 feet away from him like a lit altar that had been waiting for centuries for someone to come close enough to be illuminated, he found, beneath the fear and the vertigo and the full weight of what was coming, he found that he was not sorry. The fire between them would be tested soon. The kingdom was already at the gate. What came next would not be quiet, would not be safe, would not allow any further room for careful distance or strategically placed silences, or the comforting fiction that this was still a thing that could be managed or contained or sold. What came next was the full force of a dead religion waking inside a world that had tried to kill it, and the man who had chosen to stand between it and the king's gray and black riders. But that was tomorrow. That was the next breath. This breath, this precise, suspended, trembling breath in the east corridor with the warmth at his back and her eyes on his, and everything still holding itself open. This breath was theirs. The candle held its flame. The manor held its warmth. The story held its breath. And if you were holding yours too, if that corridor is as real to you as the room you're sitting in, if you have felt every degree of that 2 feet of distance between them the way it was always meant to be felt, in the body before the mind, then you are exactly who this story was written for. Like it? Share it with someone who has ever stood in a corridor of their own and refused to step back. Subscribe, because the inquisitors will return, and the king will send more than 6 riders next time, and the fire in her is building towards something the kingdom has no precedent for, and you will want to be standing here when it arrives. And leave me a comment. Tell me if you believe he has earned what she just said to him. Tell me if she has earned what he chose not to do. Because in the next part, both of those choices are going to be tested in ways that neither of them, not the goddess, not the man who stayed, saw coming. The east corridor's warmth pressed on. Somewhere above them, in the room she slept in, the ancient markings rested at their emberlow. Patient. Ready. Already preparing the first sentence of what the kingdom would come to call, in the histories it would not be able to prevent being written, the age of the returned fire. It had not yet begun. It was one breath away from beginning. And the only thing standing between the old world and the new one was 2 people in a corridor, 2 feet apart, choosing, breath by breath, to hold the distance and let the fire tell them when.